They warned me not to use the Ouija board. Now it won't stop. The fog in Greywater never lifted. It clung to the streets like an unwelcome guest, muffling sound and dampening colors until the whole town seemed like an old, faded photograph. It was the last place I ever wanted to be, but after my parents' divorce, I had no choice. My grandmother, Ruth, insisted I move in with her at the Thatcher estate, a crumbling mansion at the edge of town, its spires barely visible through the perpetual mist. From the moment I arrived, her warnings were insistent and cryptic. Don't go into the attic, Amelia. Some things are better left forgotten. I dismissed it as a lonely old woman's superstition. But Ruth's voice wasn't the only one whispering in Greywater. It started with a storm. The rain lashed against the warped windows of Thatcher estate, and thunder growled like a hungry wolf. Bored and restless, I started exploring. The attic was more storage room than anything else. Trunks of moth-eaten clothes, faded photographs, and furniture that smelled of mildew. Then I found it, the Ouija board. It wasn't like the cheap, mass-produced ones I'd seen before. This was something different. The wood was dark and lacquered, the planchette carved with intricate symbols that seemed to writhe under the dim light. Before I could think twice, I had dialed up my new friends, Clara and Sam. Let's prove this town's ridiculous stories wrong, I told them, and somehow, I convinced them to join me. We gathered in the attic, lit some musty candles, and placed our fingers hesitantly on the planchette. At first, nothing happened. Clara scoffed, Sam rolled his eyes. Typical, he muttered. But then the planchette moved. Welcome, it spelled, smooth and deliberate. Very funny, Clara said, though her voice shook. Which one of you is pushing it? None of us answered. Outside, the wind howled, and the candles flickered. Suddenly, a low hiss filled the room, the unmistakable sound of someone whispering, "Too close for comfort, don't leave me," the voice said in a breath that felt cold on my neck. The candles snuffed out, plunging us into darkness. The morning came with an eerie stillness. Clara and Sam refused to talk about what had happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me out of that attic. It began subtly at first. My bedroom mirror reflected. Wrong. My eyes seemed just a fraction too wide, my movements half a second behind. I'd hear my name whispered when no one was around, and objects shifted when I wasn't looking. The Ouija board? No matter how many times I buried it in the attic, it always reappeared in my room, gleaming like it had been polished. Ruth was livid when she caught me with it. I told you not to touch it. She snapped, her trembling hands gripping my shoulders. You don't understand what you've done. The caller's seen you now. The caller? She refused to explain, retreating to her room and locking the door. Left with no answers, I turned to the town library, where I met Mr. Ellers, historian who knew more about Greywater's dark secrets than anyone would admit. The Ouija board, he told me, hadn't been made for innocent fun. Decades ago, a cult in Greywater had used it to summon something they called the caller. It wasn't merely a ghost, it was a parasite, feeding on fear and binding itself to the unlucky souls who dared summon it. The more it was used, the stronger it became. It doesn't want to haunt you, Amelia, Mr. Ellers said grimly. It wants you. And it won't stop until it gets what it wants. The haunting spread like a disease. Clara started waking up with claw marks on her arms, her eyes hollow from lack of sleep. Sam stopped answering my calls, then disappeared altogether. On his bedroom walls, they found deep gouges spelling out, "The board wants more." Meanwhile, Thatcher estate warped into something almost unrecognizable. The familiar odor of wood polish and mothballs was replaced by a metallic scent that made my stomach churn. Doors opened and slammed on their own, and I'd catch glimpses of something lurking in my peripheral vision, a shadowy figure with no face, just standing there, watching. But the worst was the town itself. People I passed on the streets whispered my name under their breath, their eyes glassy and unfocused. Others muttered to themselves, speaking in overlapping voices that sounded eerily alike. It was as if Greywater itself had become infected, its roots strangled by an invisible malice. Desperation clawed at me until I returned to Mr. Ellers. He handed me a tattered journal filled with frantic notes from one of the cult's defectors. The only way to banish the caller, it said, was to sever the connection with the board by confronting it in its own domain, a spectral realm that existed somewhere between waking life and death. The ritual was precise and terrifying. At midnight, I arranged the Ouija board at the center of a chalk circle inscribed with symbols from the journal. Ruth, pale and frail, begged me not to go through with it. "You don't owe it anything," she pleaded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. But it wasn't just about me anymore. It wasn't even about Clara or Sam. It was about stopping this thing before it consumed everything. As I pressed my trembling hands to the planchette, I felt my body lurch violently. The world shifted, and suddenly I was no longer in Thatcher's estate. I stood in a twisted version of grey water, where the fog dripped like liquid, and the sky was an endless void. Time stretched and contracted, leaving me disoriented as laughter echoed from nowhere. The caller emerged from the mist, a towering, faceless figure with dozens of stretched, contorted hands clawing at the air. Its voice was a cacophony. "You came willingly," it rasped. "Why fight what you cannot destroy?" It offered me a choice: leave the ritual unfinished, and it would release me from the torment, or destroy the board and doom myself to this liminal purgatory. The temptation to give in tugged at me, but I gritted my teeth, clutching the planchette like a weapon. With everything I had, I smashed the board's planchette against the chalk circle, shattering it in two. The caller roared, its limbs stretching impossibly long as it dissolved into the howling void. Everything went silent. I woke up on the attic floor, surrounded by the splintered remains of the Ouija board. Ruth, Clara, Sam, and even Mr. Ellers were gone. As if they had never existed. The town seemed normal again, the whispers gone, the fog lighter than I'd ever seen it. People moved about their day as if nothing had happened, but I was different. My reflection lingered a second too long in mirrors, watching me after I had turned away. At night, I'd hear faint whispers on the wind, unintelligible but ever-present. Some days, I'd see flickers of movement in the corner of my eye, like shadows trying to take shape. I thought it was over, until I climbed into my car one rainy afternoon weeks later. In the rearview mirror, I saw it, the Ouija board. Its planchette quivered and moved on its own, spelling out two words across the lacquered wood: "Still here." And in that moment, I knew, you can never truly sever a connection once it's made.